So last week, we talked about JavaScript conditionals and writing if-else statements and adding logic into our code so that our code could make decisions for us and with us while we run through our programs, which added a lot more power to our code. And towards the end of that lesson, as we were going through our examples, Travis very astutely pointed out, how could we actually get this code that we're writing and this stuff displayed to the screen for the user, where a user could, for example, change a drop-down menu to select their coffee order and then have their coffee order be sent to our JavaScript from what they input on the front end, on the web page itself, which was awesome because that's exactly where we're headed. We're kind of leading into an example similar to that today. And the primary piece that is necessary for doing what Travis was asking is something called the DOM. The DOM. And now the DOM is the document object model, is what that stands for. These words probably don't really mean a whole lot, and that is okay. The most important piece to remember about document object model right now is the word document. So you may have remembered, that when we talk about HTML, we have to talk about HTML as a document or a CSS document. Usually we're talking about HTML when we say document. So you think about a physical piece of paper as an actual document. And that's how our HTML is, our hypertext markup language is a document. And the DOM really brings interaction to the page. And at its core, it is a representation of what you see on the screen. I think these are kind of like three different little kind of examples or different mental models you could build. These are supposed to be bullet points. I can figure out how to change them, so don't ignore the numbers. But it's a representation of what you see on the screen. And it is a map of our HTML that we can navigate by with JavaScript. And then the document in DOM is about our HTML document. So those are some three pieces you can kind of use to start building a mental model of what this is. The second one here, I think, is the best as far as like a map of our HTML that we can navigate by with JavaScript. It's provided from the browser, and the browser receives our HTML document and starts to render it to the page. And alongside that, when we are running our JavaScript in the browser, which is where it lives, if we open up developer tools, we're able to run JavaScript right there. It's really a gift from the browser to our JavaScript, and it's this folded up map. It's this nicely put together map of everything going on in our HTML that's given to our JavaScript that our JavaScript can leverage to make changes to our page. So it's how we actually add interactivity. Cool. So before we get too overboard on just talking at you guys, really the only way to learn this is just to do it. So we are going to be working in CodePen today. We're not going to be firing up our own website and just running this from the developer tools, because I feel like CodePen is going to offer us a little bit more flexibility here. So I'm going to Slack/message this. So CodePen project. And this is also in the lesson plan. If you have that open already, you can just click that link and it should open up a new tab. But I'm going to send it there anyway. Right, Luke, I'm going to text this to you. Okay. So once you have that ready to go ahead and follow that link, open up CodePen. And if you have a CodePen account, go ahead and log in. If you don't, that's okay. Be careful with refreshing the page. If you don't have an account, you might lose what we're doing here. It's not going to be a ton. Oh, spoiler alert, that's what we're writing. Okay. So we're not going to be writing a ton of code. If you get lost anywhere, if you refresh your page, I can just send you the code for how far we've come thus far. But I'm going to give it a couple more minutes, make sure everybody has this all pulled up. So yeah, hopefully this makes sense what we're talking about here. Does this conceptually make any sense to everybody? Any sense to anybody? John, I think you're muted, but I also think you're shaking your head.
I'll figure.
Okay. Yeah, basically when when we've been writing our JavaScript, we write functions, we're creating these things, we're calling functions, and we're outputting our return values from our functions to the console. And we see all this stuff happen in the console, and we see it happen in our functions, and we're able to use debugger statements and whatnot. And we're manipulating data and we're making changes, but nothing changes on the page. CSS immediately gives us some feedback. We can change the color of things. HTML immediately gives us feedback. We can change the structure of things. But JavaScript and what we see on the page, those two things haven't really been connected yet. And that really is all that the DOM does. It's a glue that holds together our JavaScript and what you see on the page. That's the most important part. Okay. So did everybody get this CodePen tasty buffet loaded up? Just do naughty nods. Yeah. Sean, did you get this? Okay, cool. Great. So we are going to get into it now. We're going to start writing some stuff. So what we have here is we have an HTML document. Very simple. And you'll notice that we don't start with that doc type HTML and a head and a body and meta tags and all that stuff. So this is not a full, complete, valid HTML document, but what CodePen allows you to do is to write any HTML you want in here to really quickly try out ideas. So this is also like a little sandbox. So if you wanted to just write a single div in here, you could, and it would render it over here. So it kind of is a quick way to avoid having to bootstrap a whole HTML document just to try out some ideas. So that's why we're using this today. And then as far as the CSS, we have a small bit of CSS here that's really just styling the page to center everything, put a little background on this plate. It's a horrible looking plate, but just a tiny bit of CSS. That is not really something we need to worry about today. It's just to make everything a little bit more clear as we're working on JavaScript. Okay. Oh, one other thing. If you guys don't see this console opened up down here, go ahead and click on the button in the bottom left here, far bottom left that says console, and that will open or close it. So make sure you have your console open.
Hey, Michael.
Yeah, what's up?
Currently, my page is set up with the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript on the top of the page, so I can't really see very well the plate.
Yes, I'm glad that you mentioned that. Yes. So if you click change view up here, click change view and then do editor layout to the left. Because yours probably looks like this right now. And then you can switch it like that. Awesome. Anybody else who's having that problem, it's just under change view, editor layout. Great. Okay. So we are going to write our first line of JavaScript in here, and we're actually going to do it directly in the console. So this isn't going to be saved to our file, but we're just going to write some JavaScript in here to kind of see what happens and see how we can potentially access our HTML. So what we're going to write is document, which is the D in DOM, document.query selector. That's a lowercase q, uppercase s. We're doing camel case on that. And then invoked like a function. And then inside of the parentheses for query selector, we're going to do a string. And in this string, we are going to pass a CSS selector as if we were targeting something to be styled with CSS. So we're going to pass in .buffet. So we have a class up here on this input, right? So this input right here, if we put stuff in here, click buttons, nothing really happens. We're not doing anything. These are just HTML elements we've added to the page. So this input has a class of buffet, and we're going to try to target it with our JavaScript. So by doing that, we're going to do dot, which is gosh darn it, which is the prefix for classes with CSS selectors. And we're going to type that in, buffet. And then when you hit enter, it's going to run that really quickly. So it's not adding it to our JavaScript. It's just like running it in the console. So like if you had your developer console open, it's like running code here in the browser. But this is just provided to us by CodePen. Cool. So by running that, we get a string output here. And our string output is the entire HTML element of input. It's our whole input element. And it just spit it back out to us, which is pretty cool. Because what this means is that by using document.querySelector and passing in a CSS class, we were able to actually target a specific piece of HTML using our JavaScript, which this is the beginning and kind of the entry point to the power of the DOM. Now, we use a lot of syntax here that we haven't talked about yet, right? So we haven't ever just written document straight into our JavaScript before. That's a new keyword to us. Okay, it's too large. Document's pretty big. It's the whole entire thing. But that's new. So document is a new thing. Dot query selector is also a new thing. And sorry, before I keep going here, I guess we'll slow down and look at the syntax of everything here. So document is basically, this is the map of our HTML that's provided to us via the DOM. So when you talk about the DOM, the document object model, the document, this really just means your HTML. So document is your HTML. Now this dot here, I don't want you guys to worry about this too much. So what this is called is a method. And as far as we are concerned today, we're just going to think about methods as functions. This is a new term. Whoops. Spoiler alert as well. Gosh darn it. Okay, here we go. Method is a new term, but for now, all you need to know is that they are functions we can use that are provided to us by the browser. So that's what this is, this little dot. Dot query selector, it's a function given to us by the browser. And it is on this document. Don't need to worry too much about that. This is just the syntax for how we interact with things on the page. And then because it's a function, we have our parentheses here and we pass in a parameter. In this case, the string dot buffet. That's just what this takes. And if we wanted to figure out how this works, you would just be Googling that and searching in MDN, you know, how do I target input on the page using JavaScript? And that would take you directly to the document object model documentation in MDN you'd eventually kind of land on something like this that you could use. And that's really the best way to use the DOM because there's a lot of things we can do here. And as an example, to kind of show you how much stuff can be done with the DOM and with the document, we're just going to do this really quick. We're going to open up document, or we're going to open up the DevTools and type document dot. So this now is giving us a preview of all of the methods or functions that we could use on the document object or as a part of the DOM to do things with our web page. And if you see the scroll bar, like there's tons and tons and tons of stuff we can do. Some of these are events, some of these are specific ways to target things on the page. So the document is full of information and functions that we can use. So I know that this is kind of is kind of potentially overwhelming, thinking, you know, I don't really know what query selector is. But basically, the way that we arrived at this is we thought about what we want to accomplish on our web page. We want to target an input. And then we would Google it and say, you know, how to target an input in HTML with JS. And we're going to look for MDN. And there's actually multiple ways to do this. So if we ended up here, we'd say, okay, cool, here's a way we could do this. Element.select, look at these examples, document dot. So you see this document dot, so maybe that's a little familiar, like, okay, I see that we're working with the DOM here, so maybe this is close to what I'm looking for. And you kind of follow this train of thought. This is what a lot of developing, especially with the DOM, is looking up what you want to accomplish and then finding the best way to do it. So query selector, I don't want you to worry too much about that specific word. It's just a method that allows us to access HTML elements. In this case, it takes in a CSS selector. Cool. Alrighty, so over here, let's actually use this query selector to store this value in a variable in our JavaScript. So what we're going to do is we are going to do const, let's see, let's call this user input equals, and we're going to do that. We're going to put that in there, document dot query selector dot buffet. Okay, so now we have assigned whatever the value of this is to the variable user input. So to test this out, we can go ahead and console log our variable user input. Okay. Awesome. So we see something spit out here. And it's not just coming directly from the console. This is actually coming from our JavaScript being run in the browser, and we're able to target that. Okay, so to add actual functionality to this page, because we want to be able to put something into this input, click on this button and have something happen here where it actually gets put out into our plate. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a function into this JavaScript file. And the function is basically going to add whatever we put in here onto our plate. So we're going to name it accordingly. So we're going to call it add food equals, and then we're going to do our function syntax. We're not going to do any parameters in this function for right now. We're going to do our fat arrow, brackets, drop it down. Okay. So we have created a function here that doesn't do anything. But inside of this function, we're going to go ahead and do a console.log. And we're going to console log out the variable that we assigned to the output of document.querySelector.buffet. So we're going to console log the user's input. Console log user input. Okay. And I'm going to just get rid of this guy so that we are only doing that console log in here. Okay. So the syntax for this, it should look a little bit familiar since we went over functions and did a little bit of a recap the last couple lessons. So we are declaring a variable add food, and we are assigning it the value of a function that console logs this other variable user input, which happens to be assigned to document.querySelectorBuffet. So we are using, this is the only piece of new syntax here, is using the DOM to target a part of our HTML. And then we're just going to console log that out. So if we do that, we should probably see the same thing we saw before. And it actually spit a ton out. So that's going to console log the same thing. But does anybody see what we're missing so far to be able to actually make something happen here? Any ideas as to why we're not getting anything coming out in the console? It's because we're not calling the add food function or invoking it. So it exists, it's in memory, but it hasn't been invoked. So as soon as we actually invoke it, now we get an output. Because before, and Travis will remember that we ran through this pretty in-depth last time, we added this to memory. We basically assigned this variable a value, which is a function, but we didn't do anything with it yet. We just said, hey, remember the add food is a function. And then we have to say, okay, now let's invoke it. Let's call the function. So that's why we actually get an output now after we do that. Cool. Okay, so we know that everything's working kind of as we expect so far. Is anybody having any issues following along? Any errors or anything? Are we good? Cool. So we are kind of seeing, we have a lens to look at our HTML through our JavaScript here, but we're still not doing anything with it. The value here is probably a little ambiguous still. So if we want something to happen when we click add to plate, when we click this button, we need to use something, another piece of the DOM called an event listener, which goes hand in hand with things like query selectors and using document.here. here. And it basically just means you can pay attention to anything that happens to a specific element in your HTML. And when I say happens, I mean clicks a button, or a user puts text into an input, or they highlight a piece of text. Really anything that the user does on your HTML page, like on your page, you can listen for events using an event listener, and then take actions in your JavaScript based off of what happened, and if it satisfies what you passed into those event listeners. So event listeners are a big part of using the DOM. So we're going to look at the syntax for one right now. So we are going to, first of all, we're going to comment this out. So instead of calling add food, we're going to go ahead and add an event listener that's going to handle that with us. So the first thing we're going to do is we want to be listening to the text field. Like for starters, let's just trigger some JavaScript whenever somebody types in this field. So we're going to be listening to user input. That's why we're starting with that. And we're going to do dot, which is a method, kind of like how we're interacting with the DOM for the most part here. And we're going to do add event listener. And then we're going to do our parentheses, since methods are functions. So user input dot add event listener. And we'll go ahead and throw a semicolon at the end of that. And then inside of here, addEventListener takes two parameters that we pass into this function. So the first one is, what are we listening for? What are we paying attention to inside of this text field? So there's a few things we could do. There's change, which is whenever the value in here changes. There's key down, whenever a keyboard button is pushed down. And then there's key up, whenever a keyboard button goes up after it's been pressed. So we're going to do key up because anytime that the keyboard pops up, we want to take an action with our JavaScript. And we're going to put a comma there. And the second parameter, or the second argument that goes into addEventListener here is actually the function that you want to call. And in this case, it's going to be addFood. And I actually just noticed, if you're following along in the lesson plan, this is a typo. You actually don't invoke the function inside of the event listener, you just pass the name of it in. And that's just the way that this works. If you were curious and you said, hey, I kind of remember that there was something that we could listen to events in JavaScript, but I don't remember what it is. I didn't even fully remember this syntax perfectly. Like I tried to invoke this function when I first was putting this lesson plan together, obviously, because I wrote it in the lesson plan. And this didn't work correctly. It should just be a regular old, oh, there we go, guy here. And if you put it in and you were writing this code and you forgot how it works, you're just going to go MDN add event listener. And we're just going to search MDN for this. So event target.add event listener. And okay, this is what we're doing. And we go down here. And this syntax piece here, this can be a little daunting to read this kind of documentation, but it's really valuable. And maybe at the beginning, before this is super clear, this kind of syntax with the brackets and stuff, you're like, that doesn't really look like what we're doing. I usually would encourage you to just go down and look at the simple examples. So we go down here, we see an example. That one has 3 parameters. Let's see if there's a really, really simple one. So this one, for example, this guy does have another parameter, but some element.addEventListener, mouse up. Okay, so I guess that's another thing we could listen for. And then handle mouse up. And it looks like handle mouse up is just a function. Let's see if they defined it up here. And then passive supported something else. So learning to kind of navigate through MDN is going to be really valuable to you. And it's going to be really important to like be patient with these pages and kind of read through and try to find what you're looking for, and also, learn the correct way to do things at the same time. Sometimes Stack Overflow is a better option if you really just want to see how to do a simple example really quickly. But like, for example, we reached this JavaScript example here. This probably is going to get us closer to what we're looking at. So we look at this, we see an add event listener for click, once handler. That's probably a function. Okay, once handler is a function here. So using MDN like this is how you are going to be able to find the syntax for the things you want to do. Even if you kind of vaguely remember how to do it, but you don't remember the exact syntax, use MDN or use Stack Overflow to figure out how to get there. So here we've done this. Click save. Let's see if we can get this to run. So now we are actually getting a console log every time we add something in here. Okay, so that's getting closer. But it's console logging just the input. Every time we type a letter, it's console logging the input, the whole entire thing. So what we can do here is we can add a value on here called dot value is actually going to print out the value of what was put inside of this text input here. So let's clear our console again and see if this gives us what we're typing in.
Hey, Michael, what is the DA on line 5?
Oh, that is a massive mistake. That was just an accident.
Gotcha.
Thanks, man. That was the problem. That was why that wasn't working. Okay, here we go. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G stuff. Typing in there. Okay. So it took us a long time to get here. Apologize for that. But now we're able to actually type stuff into this input and see an output just printed out to the console as it happens. Let's make sure everybody gets to this point. So make sure in your event listener that you are just putting in the function name. and not invoking it, because the syntax for addEventListener does not take in the invocation, it just takes the name. That was my mistake, back and forth a bunch. I was just confused by what was happening here. So if we get to this point, you should be able to type in here and see the output printed out to the console. Does that look good for everybody? Everybody there so far? Okay. So that's supposed to be an exciting moment for Chris Pratt. It's excited to see something actually happening with the DOM. So we're starting to get closer to being able to use this to do interesting things. So we're getting output to the console. We're still not putting anything onto the DOM here though, or putting anything back into our page. We're just taking it from the page. So we're just gathering information from the user at this point. We're not actually spitting it back out. So next up, we're going to figure out how we can actually spit this data that we're getting back out to the user and do something with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to do something kind of like what we did here in line 1, but for a different element on the page. So if we wanted to target the plate here, and we wanted to store all of this HTML, like this HTML element in a variable with our JavaScript, just like we did for the input, does anybody want to walk me through the syntax for how we might try to target the plate using document.querySelector? Going once.
Which is part of the HTML code, right?
Yeah, so in the HTML, let's look here. So we have our input was right here. Then we have a button. And then here is plate, which is a div. It's a div.
So then wouldn't you
plate.
type document.querySelector and then call the plate?
Okay, so then by call, do you mean like invoke the query selector function? Okay, and then call the plate?
Yeah,
what we're doing here next?
Quote dot plate.
Awesome. And why did we do dot before plate?
Because that's what you did with buffet.
Yeah, that's fair. So we didn't go over a ton of, it's been a long time since we touched on CSS, but in CSS, when you're trying to style a class, you target it using the dot before the name of the class. So like if we look in here, we targeted our CSS with dot plate. And that's kind of like the gift that they're giving us here, is that, hey, this is an easy thing to use because you just target things the same way you do with CSS. So that's why we did a dot, because this is a class. Okay, cool, great. So we did document.querySelector plate. Are we missing anything? Let's see. Uncaught type error, failed to execute query selector on document. One argument required, but only 0 present. So that's a little bit of a misleading error, but we do have a problem here. Can we do anything with this value?
Not at the moment.
Okay. I'm gonna popcorn.
We want to be able to put whatever the user inputs onto the plate.
At this point, we're just trying to target the plate and then store it in a variable.
So don't we have to assign it a value?
So this is the value. We need to assign it to a variable.
That's so yeah.
So what would you name this variable?
Just output, maybe.
Output? Okay.
Yeah. Perfect.
Output is document.querySelector plate. Okay, awesome. So let's go ahead and console log that now. And what do you guys think this is going to do? What do you think console log output is going to give us? Think about it. Okay, so it gave us the string of our div plate. So we were able to target our plate correctly. This is a good, as Luke had said, a good sanity check to make sure that what we're writing here is giving us the values we expected. Like if we misspelled plate here, this is a good check to be able to save that. And then it's like, whoa, that's not what I expected, null. So that's a great practice, because once you do something like this, assign a value, write some code, and you're like, I know what this is supposed to be. Go ahead and just console log really quickly. Make sure that it is what you expect it to be. So in this case, it is. We're getting div class plate. Cool. Awesome. Good work, Travis. Alrighty, so now we have the plate stored in our JavaScript, but we need to do something with it. So what we are going to do is we're going to use the DOM, not just to get information from the user, but we're going to use the DOM to, or use some methods on the DOM to actually spit information back out. So inside of add food, instead of just console logging the user's input, the user input.value, we are going to append it into the HTML here, into this place. We want to basically shove some information in between the opening and closing div tag here. And to do that, we are going to use a method called append. So we have output, which is our variable, which represents this. It represents this right here, but we want to put something right here. So to do that, we are going to use a method called append. Output.append, and we are going to stick in user input.value, which is what we were console logging up here, because we know that this gives us what we were typing. Remember, we were typing, we saw it all spit out every time we put a character down, or we pushed a key down. So now output.append user input.value. So, and we're calling this function only when the key pops up. This is the event we're listening for when we're inside of this input here. How is this font size for everybody, by the way? Does it look okay? Is that legible? Okay. All right, so let's type in here and let's see what happens. Okay, so we are getting some output every time, but do you notice this? Like every time I let my keyboard up, it spits out everything in the text input, and it actually like appends it onto the end of that code in there. So that it's doing exactly what we told it to do, but it's not exactly working the way that we want it to, which is great, because at this point now we're just kind of into debug mode where we can kind of figure out how to make this work the way that we want it to work. So we probably don't want it to pop out every single time we do this. You guys notice how we're not using our add to plate button? We could use that button to only put this food onto our plate when the button is clicked, right? That would probably make more sense than doing it on a keyup, because even this, like even a backspace, like appends more information onto the end here. And just for the fun of it, let's go ahead and right click and inspect on this little piece of text here and take a look at what's happening. So if we look at our plate, this is the HTML that is in the browser, the HTML that the browser is rendering and like what this sees. So see how our HTML that we sent to the browser just has an empty plate div, but then the HTML now that the browser has is full of all of these like pieces of text, these little strings that we're adding in. So this is us actually manipulating the DOM. This is what the browser sees over here. When you right click and you go into the elements, this is for HTML elements. So that's pretty cool. So if we add in here, you know, let's see, beyond burgers, you can see it getting added like live. See that? The purple ones that pop up? Like that's pretty cool. So we're able to see what's happening as we're going there. The elements tab here in the DevTools is helpful for seeing what the HTML looks like live, you know, because this is kind of static for what we send to the browser, but we can use the DevTools to actually look at what's happening over there. Okay. So let's try to make this food get put onto the plate only when we click the add to plate button. And as an aside on the append method here, so you might be thinking like, how did we come up with append? You know, like, am I supposed to just remember all these things? Am I supposed to memorize all of these different methods that we use to manipulate the DOM? And the answer is no. You definitely don't need to memorize this kind of stuff. Some of these things will naturally, you know, stick in your brain because you use them a lot. For example, document dot. That's a good thing to learn, to know that anytime you want to manipulate the document or get something from your HTML, you're going to probably use document dot and whatever method you need to use to get something back. Now, for me, for example, you know, a lot of people might have every method they need memorized for how to do this. But personally, I would, you know, look it up. I would say, okay, I want to put this text into this div because I know it's a div on the plate over here, and I don't want it to replace it. I want it to like, be added onto it. So I just Googled like how to add, text into a div using, and you could even put document dot and then see what kind of results you get. And eventually it'll take you to either a Stack Overflow post or an MDN article. And honestly, I learned about append putting together this lesson. I was going to use innerHTML, which is a different method that I had known from before. So using this kind of stuff is usually just a process of like using a good phrase to Google, like what you're trying to accomplish, and then implementing it, which is where this quote comes from. I haven't seen The Office, but I know everybody loves The Office. Okay, all righty, let's try to clear this. Let's go ahead and refresh this page. If you refresh the page, it should clear out what's on your plate there. So, okay. All right, so let's think about the problem statement that we have here now. So instead of our event happening on the keyboard actions in the input, we want our event only to happen on the button here. So does anybody have an idea as to one of the first steps we could take here to kind of get us closer to our solution? So once again, the problem is we want to click a button, and on the action of clicking this button, we want to add information to the plate.
Forgive my terminology, but don't we have to do the same thing that we did for the add food function to basically tell the JavaScript that we're using the button as a thing to listen for?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. So let's start. If we need to listen to the button, what's one of the first things we would need to do to be able to listen to it or to access it?
addEventListener.
Okay, we need to add event listener, but we have to add an event listener to something, right?
Yeah.
Like
so
we need to be able to add it to the element.
Would that still be a user input?
It could be. We're going to assign it to a variable. So like what variable name would you give to the plate here? Or this button add to plate?
Add to.
Okay, perfect. So we're going to call it add to. Awesome. And then we need to get it. So we need to get it from the DOM before we can then manipulate it and use it. So we're going to go document dot query selector. And this guy is, what is the class for this button?
Button.
Class? Because we can actually see it in our HTML.
Oh, add.
Okay, so the class is add. So now we're able to get this guy. We're going to do our sanity check. We're going to console log add to. Okay, save. Doop. Awesome. So we got our button. That's exactly what we wanted. Now we want to do the event listener like you were talking about, Travis, right? So let's go ahead and do that. Let's do it down here because this is kind of where our other one was. So Sean, do you want to walk me through how I could add an event listener to this variable? So it's a variable called add to that Travis created, and this is basically the button. And we're trying to do a very similar thing to what we did here with user input. So we were adding an event listener to the user input, which is this, but now instead we want to be listening to the button click, not the user's input.
So it would just be add to dot add event listener, and would it be like mouse click instead of keyup?
Yeah, that's awesome. So you're thinking mouse click.
I don't know what it's called, but so I'm imagining that.
No, you're definitely on the right track. Okay, and then is there anything else we would need to add in here, Sean? Because we're listening for the mouse click, right?
Well, I'm assuming kind of what you had on the other one. We'd probably have add food in there as well, right?
Okay, sweet. Yeah. So what is this going to do then?
It will. I honestly don't know.
But think about how this line exits. So think about what happened when we did this, and then think about all of these similarities in syntax to what we're writing here and thinking about like what potentially would happen. So if I type, you know, burrito in here, and then I click add to plate,
it'll throw it in the console. It'll record it.
Hopefully it adds it to the actual plate itself, because in our add food function, and this is where we're going to kind of follow the thread of logic here. So we go into our add food function. In add food, it gets executed. Then we have output is a variable. Output is the plate itself. Okay, cool. So we targeted the plate. And then append, so we're appending, we're using this method, this function, append, to then stick in, and we're passing that one user input.value, which from the beginning, that user input.value, user input's right here. This guy, buffet is our input here. So this is kind of when we start building a good practice of following the thread of execution when you're writing JavaScript. So this gives you the opportunity to basically look at your code and say, you know, and this is a muscle that takes a lot of time to build over as we go here. But basically you look at your code, you think, okay, where is this going to go? What is this variable assigned to? What is that variable assigned to? And you kind of are bouncing back and forth, you know, like you're looking here and then you're looking over here. And then you realize that you have a variable probably. Oh, where's that defined? And then you go up and say, okay, here it is. It's defined right here. And it looks like this is what it is. So then you come back down here and you know what's going, you know what this is. And then you realize that we're calling the method append on it. So kind of that train of thought is something that takes a lot of practice, and it's something you'll do constantly as a developer. And it's a really good muscle to build as we go. It also will teach you the benefit of using descriptive variable names, because if you have a really descriptive variable name, it reduces your cognitive load as to what you have to read and other code you have to look at. So for example, if we look at user input, this is a pretty descriptive variable name of what it is, what its value is, right? So it is assigned to the HTML element that is a user input. Now this reduces the cognitive load quite a bit because you don't have to really look this up. You don't have to go reference this again for the most part. So if we go down here and we look at user input.value, this is a very clear piece of code. Even though we don't know exactly, we aren't looking at the variable definition of this right here, but we just know by the name of it what it is. So using descriptive variable names is a really, really good practice to be in. And as you start learning more and practicing, you'll realize that you shoot yourself in the foot with like undescriptive variable names all the time. So just a side note there. Okay, Sean, you are very right that is what we want to do. And if we wanted to figure out how we could actually trigger this, we would just Google something like this. You would get as close as you can. So what we did was we put mouse click event listener. That's what we're trying to do. So go element click event. Okay, that sounds like what we want. Scroll down to an example. Okay, button.addEventListener, and it looks like it's just click, right? So this is exactly what we would do. So Sean, it doesn't matter that you didn't know the exact string to pass to this function, because it takes 1.5 seconds to figure out the right one to put in there. So cool, you're on the right track. We're still programming, we just had to figure out the right syntax. So it's just click instead of mouse click. So let's put that in there. And now we're going to trigger our function add food. We are going to clear our console, save, and let's see what happens. So before, as we typed, something showed up in the place. So hopefully that doesn't happen and we get something else. Okay, so we know that worked because we removed this guy. So this is out. So we're not worrying about keyup. We're worrying about click on this button. Whoops, I just cleared that out. Okay, because I saved it. Okay, so we're going to put pizza in there. And we're going to click add to plate. Okay, that's awesome. And it did work, which is great. So we actually see what we put up here, output out here. And if we put something else in, what do you guys think will happen?
It'll get added to what's already there.
Yeah, which is pretty cool. So now we're starting to see some extensibility here. We're starting to see that we can actually, use this information and persist it, at least for a little bit on the page here. This isn't quite what we want, right? Like this doesn't look great. We probably want these as separate HTML elements. Because one of the things about just shoving text inside of a div here is it's not individually targetable. Like, let's say you wanted to be able to style each word differently, or maybe every other item you wanted to have a background color, something like that. So if you wanted to be able to style this, you need to have it exist as its own HTML element. So what we could do is this is what I did when I was putting this lesson together, is just Googling, how to append, a HTML element into another HTML element rather than just the text itself. And we're not going to go all the way through that whole rabbit hole of like that Googling, but basically I learned that, first of all, you need to create a new element basically in your JavaScript. So what that looks like is a pretty straightforward syntax. What we're going to do is we're going to create a new variable called p, because this is going to be a paragraph tag. We want all of these guys to just live in paragraph tags as we stick them in there. So const p equals document.createElement p. And the way that I found this was in my Googling of how to make this a tag that gets put in there instead of a piece of text. I ran across some examples. I looked at 3 or 4 different websites and I saw, oh, okay, most of these websites, they're all using document.createElement, and then they're assigning that to a variable, and then they're sticking it in there. So that's a pretty, straightforward flow, and it's part of the development cycle here. So we figure out, okay, this is pretty clear as well as to what it's doing. Part of the reason is because we have an awesome descriptive method here that tells us what this function is going to do. It's going to create an HTML element, and we want to do p tag. If we put something in here like garbage, probably won't work because that's not a valid HTML element. But we know that a p tag, a paragraph tag, is. So we're going to make a paragraph tag, p. Cool. Now, there's another method we can use called innerHTML. And this one is also descriptive as to what it does. The syntax is different though. So instead of being a function that you invoke like this, like if you wanted to add innerHTML here, you need to do it like this. You assign it a value. And we are going to do user input .value, because that's what is getting spit out here, right? So we're getting this. So then what is the last thing we would want to change? So we're creating a paragraph element. We are giving the paragraph element some content. And then is there anything else we need to change to make this work so that we're putting a paragraph tag with content into the plate rather than just the text itself?
I was thinking clear the input box, but that might be next.
Yeah, that would kind of be a validation thing that we could do. And that's actually in the homework, that's one of the stretch goals. So you're up there, you're getting there, Luke. So what we need to do, first of all, let's just run it and see what happens. So far we don't really know if it's working or not, because this could be a paragraph tag. Could we check? How would we check to see if this is a paragraph tag or just text?
Inspect it?
Exactly. So we can inspect this to see what the browser sees. So when we inspect this, we see, nope, it really is just text there. So if we add burgers now, okay, so these are not paragraph tags because it would show up like a paragraph tag. So why is that the case? Why? It's doing the same thing it was before. And the reason is because we aren't actually using this paragraph variable, this p variable that we created, right? So what we could do is, if we were debugging this to say, why, I don't know why this is happening, we would console log our variables. Okay, let's console log that. And then, we did something, we changed p a little bit here because we called this inner.HTML method there. And especially if this is the first time you were using that method, you would be curious like what it did to your variable. Like, how did this change anything? So let's put 2 console logs in here. And now what this is going to do is this is going to spit out whatever's happening here as we click on the button. So pizza, that's a plate. Okay, so what did our first console log give us? A paragraph tag. That's definitely what we expected. We expected const p is assigned to document.createElement p. Cool, nice. So not only did that verify that, if this is the first time we've used this, maybe we didn't know if P is the right parameter to put in here, but we saw an example and we kind of assumed it was. This is a learning opportunity. So we see, okay, dope, I understand a lot more about how this method works now. So if we wanted to like just test this out to see, like I'm assuming that div is going to give us a div. Let's see if that's true. Okay, it is. So you've a tiny little nugget of understanding that is growing as to how this works just by the context of everything. So cool, that's working how we expect. Now we console log P after doing innerHTML, and do a burger. And we got a paragraph tag with burger inside of it. So this is totally what we want, right? But we're just spitting text out onto the plate. What do we need to change so that we're putting the paragraph tag with our text content onto the plate? It's on line 13. We need to make a change to line 13.
Yeah, the P has to be outputted.
Cool. So instead of putting in the user input.value, we want this to be the paragraph tag. We want this to be the P variable. Because the whole reason we created the P variable was to manipulate it so that it was an actual HTML tag rather than just text. But then we weren't doing anything with it. We were just going right back to using the old user input.value shoved in here, which wasn't really getting us any closer to where we wanted to be.
So is this basically saying that the variable P includes the user input?
At this, you mean right here?
Yeah.
So yes, so innerHTML basically just shove content inside of an existing tag, or in this case, a brand new tag that we just created. So we just created one and it's just floating in JavaScript land as a value. Really, it's a string. So it's just a string. And then by using innerHTML, we are then shoving content into that tag. And then we are using that tag that we created. So innerHTML gets or sets the HTML markup contained within the element. Okay, cool. So syntax, element.innerHTML equals HTML string. Now this is a good example. This one is a little bit more straightforward to understand. So we can kind of see how to set content inside of an HTML element. If we go down to an example, we're probably going to see, there we go. So we can see, okay, now it looks like they're actually adding like a string that's a script tag with some JavaScript inside of it. And then they're shoving that inside of an element and assigning that variable to it. So yes, so that is how innerHTML works. And that one's a pretty common one. You'll use innerHTML quite a bit if you're not using frameworks. So yeah, so now it looks the same, but we have a hunch that things are working better. So let's try adding another one. Dope. So we see things, they're actually formatted differently. And the reason is because these are individual elements rather than just text shoved into a tag. So click on there. We see, cool, that's a paragraph tag. It has like some styling that's probably getting inherited from our CSS, or maybe that's a browser default. So we see individual tags. Now the benefit here is that we can target these for more JavaScript or for CSS styling or whatever. So they actually are targetable pieces of hypertext markup that lives in our page now. So this is HTML we can use rather than just text that's been shoved into a div. So that's much better. Cool. And if we keep adding stuff, you know, we see that it just gets in there and then it looks like it's probably going to scroll. Oh, yeah, a couple more. Yeah, so then we have a bunch of stuff on our plate. Awesome. So we are using our text input. We are using our add to plate button. But it's also going to add an empty string, which is, we didn't really make any JavaScript adjustments to prevent us from doing something like that, which we called like a form validation. But we don't need to worry about that right now. So we are able to add stuff to our plate using the DOM to get and set information, which that's pretty sweet. We're definitely actually making an interactive page here now. So this is a lot to take in. The only things that I would change as to what you guys have written here is I think we might want to change some of these variable names a little bit. And talking about making our variable names descriptive, let's see, we have user input. Okay, buffet, which is an input that's coming from the user. So in JavaScript land, that's exactly what this is to us. That makes sense. So we have output, document query selector plate. So output is true, but this is one thing, Travis, to keep in mind, and everybody, is that when you're naming your variables, sometimes it's better to think about them from the developer's perspective rather than the user's perspective. So when you say output, that's kind of more from a user's perspective because it's output onto the plate. But what this technically is in JavaScript is it is simply the element. It is a div element with a class plate. That's all it is. So we want to be as kind of stupidly simply descriptive as possible. So considering that, I mean, what else could we call this? I mean, and think like a dumb, simple word for this that just explains what it is. Probably just plate. So that's probably an easier and more descriptive variable name we could use here. Const add to. Okay, awesome. So we have query selector add. Now, add is a button. That's good. Now, this is a better variable name than the last one we looked at because it's getting more descriptive as to what's happening. But what kind of things take actions in JavaScript? Like what kind of things actually make changes to our code and to our page? Those are going to be functions. But this is really just a value. This isn't a function at all. So generally you want to say variable names that are actiony, like do something for functions, and you would want to use descriptive names for what something is for pieces of content like a string. So for this one, I think we probably just want to call it add button. Because right here, we don't actually know what .add is. So if this is just called add, maybe we don't know exactly what part of the HTML we're targeting here, and we'd have to go, if a different developer jumped in or you forgot what this was and you're coming back later, you'd have to jump back into your HTML file and go through and be like, okay, what has the class add? Okay, the button has the class add. So then you come back over here and then you're keeping in your mind, you're remembering, okay, now add as a variable is a button. It is a button. And that's like a little piece of memory that you're using up in your own brain to have to continue reading through your code. But if this is just called add button, you're freeing up that mental energy because you're saying, okay, sweet, this is add button. So anytime you run across this variable name later on in your code, you don't have to think about it. You know exactly what it is. So that's where descriptive variable names come in really handy. And that's something you'll just have to learn with time. The more variables you write, the more horrible and good variable names you'll use, which will hopefully teach you in the future what could be better. And in a professional work environment, like sometimes like 50% of code review is just people arguing about what the variable name should be. So it's actually a contentious thing and something that people spend a lot of time thinking about. There's plenty of articles and stuff on it too. Okay, so we changed this to add button, and we were using it somewhere else, right? We probably need to change the other variable name because before this was add to, right? And now we are changing it to add button. So we need to change where we're referencing it. So we're going to do add button down here as well. So I think this is it. And whenever we make a change like that, you definitely want to save it and run it and make sure that it actually, oh, output is not defined. Okay. So we see that we changed something that we didn't reference elsewhere. So output is not defined. Cool. We got output.append, and we actually changed output to plate. So we're gonna do plate.append p. Okay, save it, run it. Awesome. Okay, looks like we're back in business. Great, cool. That's an old error. Perfect. So back to where we need to be. And if you guys change your variable names, I encourage you to change these back to something descriptive. You don't have to name them exactly like this, but just think about, keep those concepts in mind as you're naming variables. This is it. This is all the JavaScript we're going to write today. This is 11 lines of JavaScript. There is a lot of new syntax here, and it feels a little overwhelming. And actually, I'm going to add some comments here. Is a mouse click on the .add button. Okay. And I'm going to share this with you guys. I'll actually probably save this and then share a new link. Actually, this link will automatically update, which is cool. But yeah, so we have a lot of new syntax here. We're talking about methods. Methods is one of the newest like general ideas that we're using. And like I said, for now, just think about methods are functions that are gifted to us from the browser. They are things we can use from the browser to use JavaScript to access our page. So I know I stumbled over my words a few times on this one, just trying to kind of express some of these ideas about the DOM. But from a very high level, does the DOM make more sense to you guys now? Like what kind of it is and how we can use it? Would you guys like to go over, like now that we've kind of seen some DOM manipulation, do you guys want to go back over the definitions of the DOM?
Yeah, sure.
That'd be helpful. And we don't have to, but let's see what, did I miss any other slides? I had the homework. Guys, have you seen this?
No, but it's hilarious.
Ryan Gosling won't eat his cereal. It's this dude that just like holds up like a spoonful of cereal to like his TV screen during scenes with Ryan Gosling. Oh, it's so good.
That's fantastic.
It slays me. I love it. Okay, where are we going? So let's go back to this slide. The DOM is a representation of what you see on the screen. It is a map of our HTML that we can navigate by using JavaScript. So it's basically a map that JavaScript can understand. And it is the document, which is HTML document. It's really how HTML and JavaScript are friends. That's really all it boils down to. There's more complexity to it, and you'll hear people talk about DOM trees and nodes and blah, 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 and all this stuff, but don't worry about it for now. It's really just the glue that holds HTML to JavaScript. That's it. Okay. So for our homework, and I'm going to try to end this lesson a little earlier. I know that these have been going stupid long. So our homework today is going to be making some additions to the tasty buffet here. And what we're going to do is you're probably going to do this work in CodePen yourself. So first of all, first thing, make sure you don't do it in the same URL that I sent you guys. So this URL that I sent, like any changes that I save, like if you guys refresh your page, you're probably going to see this totally like change, unless, actually, I don't know exactly how that works, but basically you're going to want to create a new pen and then copy and paste the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in, and then go ahead and make your edits to your own version. Also, if you wanted to, you can copy and paste all the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript into a file locally, and you could set up your own brand new HTML document and do it, just open index.html in the browser like we've done in the past. You can totally do it like that. It's up to you. The only reason I chose CodePen for this is because I wanted to just cut down on extra stuff like having to write a full-blown HTML document. I just wanted to focus on the JavaScript today. But you guys do it however you would like to do it. But the homework is to, first of all, do a buffet remodel. So add some CSS styling to give your buffet some heart and soul. Make any changes, just don't remove don't remove any DOM functionality. Probably want to add DOM functionality instead of remove any. And then we're going to add a new feature to the buffet. So the chow down feature. So write a second function that the chow down button will use, and then update the stomach paragraph accordingly. So if we look over here, we see we had a paragraph tag up here called stomach that we never used, and we also had a chow down button that we never used. So this chow down button right here doesn't really do anything. And then this is just an empty p tag that's invisible because there's no content. So we are going to add some stuff into that. And hopefully that is reminiscent of what we're doing here. We're just kind of doing it backwards. So you're adding it to the plate, and then we're taking information from what's in the plate div, and we're going to use it when this button is clicked. So very, very similar syntax is going to happen here. And then as a part of that, we're going to say if the user added less than 3 items to their plate, then the paragraph tag with the class of stomach should have content added that says something about still being hungry. If the user added 4 or 5 items, then the paragraph tag should display something about being satisfied. If it added more than 5, something about being full. And then that something is the content that would go inside of this paragraph with the class of stomach. All right, and then some stretch goals. If that is too easy peasy for you, we are going to go into the stretch goals, the Michelin stars. So think about making your buffet accessible. So look into some ARIA attributes, specifically ARIA live regions, which are really cool. And we can talk about those next class. And when a user clicks add to plate, clear the text input. That was Luke's thought about doing some form validation is what this is called. That would just make it a better user experience. And then another one, if a user types in pizza specifically, add the pizza emoji instead of the text itself. And lastly, see if you can animate the food appearing on the plate with transitions or keyframes. Like I said, these are stretch goals, so don't worry about it. But if you have time and you want to do the homework, these are the main things that will help to reiterate some of the stuff we talked about today. So like I said, I know it's a lot. I'm wondering if potentially I could have taught some of these things in a different order as far as JavaScript, because there's a couple more core JavaScript concepts that we're going to be learning about, specifically objects and arrays. And objects have things called methods on them, and that's why the method thing is a little confusing, probably because we haven't talked about that yet. So I may have made a mistake by not teaching these in the right order, but I feel like it's time for you guys to see something fun happening on the page. And I wanted to get to that as soon as possible. So you guys are my guinea pigs. Like I said, maybe we have to go back and switch the order and talk about objects and arrays first, but it can get a little dry without having any fun stuff happen on the web page. So so we'll see. We'll get there, and hopefully this becomes clear. But Luke, I'm actually curious. Do you remember what order you learned this stuff in?
Not necessarily. It was kind of all together like this. I mean, you set up your your HTML page, your CSS page, and JavaScript page, and then it kind of all goes together after that. I'm pretty sure though I did this before creating my own objects though. I think.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, because to create your own object, like you kind of have to have like, well, what do I want my object to be? And that's a bit more of a leap than like, I want to just make something show up and like I wanted to click this button and make it do something. You know what I mean?
Right.
So
right.
I think this is a great starting point, especially with CodePen, like having it all here and not having to create all the boilerplate in the HTML file, just like only seeing what's going to show up. That's like very clear.
Cool. Thanks, Luke. Sean, Travis, I'm curious from your guys' perspective, how confusing is this is kind of turned into the format of the class, is me now begging you guys for feedback on what I did wrong towards the end. But how overwhelmed and confused and like zoned out do you feel thinking about what we talked about here today conceptually? Like whenever we start talking about methods and you see like the dot stuff, like there's a lot of new syntax, like I said. Like how much of this just feels like you're just drowning in the deep end, you are just over it?
I'm always overwhelmed, man. So
no, I mean this is huge. Like Sean, I really value your feedback on this because I want to make this as
No,
like there's problems I have to fix.
A lot to learn, man. It's just like it's just gonna take. It's definitely not something that just like sticks after one time, And like for me, it's easy to follow along, but then when it's just myself trying to learn this, like trying to do this stuff over again, it's like I can't remember anything,
Yeah, and that is totally expected. And I mean, as a note, like obviously this is fun, this is free time. I don't expect you guys to, I expect you guys to do whatever you want to do. But if you do the homework, it's set up so that like I'm expecting you guys to kind of have the lesson plan on one window and then have the homework on another window. And like most everything in the homework is almost totally, word for word laid out for you in the lesson plan. So hopefully there aren't too many giant leaps to do the homework. I know that makes it more time consuming having to go back and reference, but like even just Command F for stuff. Like if you're like, I forgot what I have to do here, just search Command F document dot in the lesson plan, and then that will hopefully help get you there. So that's kind of just a glimpse into how I'm formatting these things, is that if you do have the lesson plan open, it will really, really help you get these things completed easier, because it's not like I'm expecting you to pull this out of your memory. The whole goal of the homework is just to not have me telling you what to type, but having you instead having to search and then find it and read it and type it yourself. Even though you're not remembering it, it's still, that's the second time it's gone into your brain, and there's going to have to be 100 more before it really gets stuck. But, slowly taking the training wheels off, but just so you guys know. But yeah, that's it for the DOM introduction. Like I said, I think the biggest takeaway I want you guys to have from this is the idea that the DOM is the glue that holds our JavaScript to our HTML. It's the connecting tissue between JavaScript and HTML.
I was just reading the Wikipedia page for the DOM the other day, because I was like just curious, like what this thing is that we all work with all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So this is, yeah, like I was like, that was like literally last night.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's kind of ambiguous, the document object model. But it's kind of funny when you break that down, because when we're talking about methods, you always call methods on an object, and your document that document is your HTML, and the model is basically that it is not literally like your specific HTML. It's a representation of it. It's a map to navigate it. It's a model. It's like a miniature model of your HTML that then your JavaScript can talk to. So it kind of makes sense. I also kind of hate that name though, because DOM is just, it seems like something somebody wanted to make because it sounded weird and sci-fi. But whatevs. I guess that's fun too. So, all right, dudes. Yeah, I want to keep the class shorter. What do you guys think about this length of class versus the other ones?
I love it.
Is this better?
Yeah, for sure. It just, I was super fried. The long, like the 3-hour one. No, it's partially my fault because I was like lost in questions, but yeah, this is much more digestible.
I think just normal human brains, like going like for an hour to an hour and a half is like the most I can handle before I just start. Like usually an hour is the top for me before I need like a break and need to like do something else. But
do you think it would be benefit from being even shorter, or
no? I think that this felt great. Like if you like, and I think it's also fine. Like if a lesson doesn't, like if you're not able to complete a full lesson, I think like breaking stuff up into 2 might be
right.
It's like, oh, this is going to be longer than